Dr. Laura Briggs is a scholar of U.S. Empire and the Americas. She received her AB from Mount Holyoke College, her MTS from Harvard University, and her PhD in American Studies from Brown University. Her research studies the relationship between reproductive politics, neoliberalism, and U.S. and international child welfare policy. Professor Briggs has been at the forefront of rethinking the field and frameworks of transnational feminisms, with her new published book, Taking Children, A History of American Terror, which examines the 400-year-old history of the United States, taking children from marginalized communities, including Black and Native children during America's founding, to the Donald Trump's policy of family separation for Central American migrants and asylum seekers in the US-Mexico border as a violent tool for political ends. Professor Briggs also recently co-edited a special issue of Meridian's Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism on radical transnationalisms, reimagining solidarities, violence, and empires that brings transnational feminism studies into new light by developing new and alternative analytic frameworks and exploring alternative and forgotten epistemologies of the field. You can find a full copy of her bio on the CSREA website, but this afternoon I want to welcome Professor Laura Briggs to these conversation series and hand over to her. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Banu. That was really nice. And I'm going to talk today about the U.S. feminist movement and the politics of race and transnational solidarity. Last month, I was struck that it was the first time in a while that I'd felt the presence of large-scale celebrations of International Women's Day in the United States. Unions called for the passage of the American Rescue Plan. The Biden administration highlighted the presence of Kamala Harris as vice president. Demonstrations in New York City called for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Facebook posts proclaimed support for Dylan Farrow and her charges against Woody Allen. And while it was exciting to see feminism sticking its head up again, I was struck by how un-international these US celebrations were, even as feminists called attention to International Women's Day on virtually every continent, nation, and region. The US feminist movement, with some conspicuous exceptions, has become decidedly national in its orientation. It's hard to remember in these inward-focused times in the United States, but the feminist movement of the 1970s was born transnational. When we look back at the Mexico City Conference and its resolutions for International Women's Year in 1975, its optimism is striking. We had not yet seen the religious and neoliberal backlash against gender equality, and it was possible to believe that colonialism was passing away and development would bring prosperity to impoverished women throughout what we called then the Third World. As International Women's Year became International Women's Decade, it became clear that Thatcherism was, among other things, an effort to reinvigorate old school colonialism, and Reagan made anti-abortion politics one of his signature issues. Together, Reagan and Thatcher used the World Bank and International Monetary Fund to turn development into a caricature of itself, a mechanism to get the Third World to pay tribute to banks in New York and London, while steadily diminishing the sovereignty of states in the decolonized world, producing what is now a massive refugee and immigration flow as people follow their national wealth to a small number of metropoles. Still, throughout the Cold War 1980s, both right-wing anti-communist militarism and a left and feminist peace movement demanded an end to hot wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and CIA-sponsored or abetted coups in places as diverse as Iraq, Chile, and the Congo. From the 1970s to the 90s, feminist critiques of women in globalization, the global assembly line, and structural adjustment policies, many of them forcefully articulated by women's research centers founded in the years following the 1975 Mexico City Conference, provided international leadership to the left, and articulated a politics of the feminization of poverty. From 1975 to 1985, the International Women's Decade delegates from governments were joined by activists from non-governmental organizations or NGOs in ever larger and more complex international feminist conferences in Copenhagen and Nairobi. In addition, as Maylee Blackwell points out in her work on Indigenous feminists in Latin America, the encuentros that led up to the official conferences were a place where minoritized women struggled for their place at the big international conferences. When they lost, some of them organized, building further encuentros like that of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of Abiyala, a dense network of Indigenous women from across the Americas. The US feminist movement was a significant player in global solidarity, working, including particularly in our hemisphere, working from Chile to Central America to Puerto Rico. We spoke out against sterilization, sent tampons to the guerrilleras of the Faribundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador, and worked against the rise of neoliberal anti-communist right from Chile to Guatemala. US feminists built transnational linkages in solidarity with other left movements around the world as a natural outgrowth of the feminist movement's birth in the New Left, supporting people's right to be free from US intervention and supporting burgeoning feminist and queer movements globally. All that international solidarity work started to fall apart in 2001. Throughout the Cold War, the intelligence agencies of NATO countries and a global network of right-wing leaders had undermined and attacked leftists while fashioning right-wing religious fundamentalists into a formidable global alternative to socialism and communism. When Wahhabi Muslim fundamentalists associated with Osama bin Laden turned around and bit the US capitalist and military hand that fed them, attacking the World Trade Centers, the Pentagon, and targeting the US government, it produced a crisis for the solidarity politics of the left, particularly for feminists. When George W. Bush articulated his support for those he called women of cover, veiled women, he simultaneously stole an issue from the Feminist Majority Foundation in the US and reiterated a move straight out of French colonialism in Algeria and the British in Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq. Bush also split the male left from the feminist left. By appropriating a liberal feminist critique of the Taliban as part of the justification for a US attack on Afghanistan, made explicitly in the name of US empire and not repudiated by the Feminist Majority Foundation, events began to overtake the alliance between feminism and anti-imperialism. While we could legitimately fault the Feminist Majority Foundation for failing to articulate the problems from a feminist perspective of dropping US bombs on civilian targets as a defense of women, the male left compounded the strains of the anti-imperialist left and feminist coalition by cheering the very religious fundamentalists who had defeated the socialist and feminist movements in their countries in the name of anti-US imperialism and anti-Zionism. Feminists could hardly support right-wing fundamentalist movements that named anti-feminism as a raison d'etre, but the anti-imperialist boy left began to call these movements the heart of global anti-imperialism. As Meredith Tax, a left feminist active since the 1970s, explains, in left circles, quote, fundamentalist movements that appropriated the language of national liberation were more easily accepted than feminists who opposed them in the language of universal human rights. Or as women living under Muslim laws put it in a letter to the World Social Forum in 2005, quote, The worldwide support once given to both victims and resistors of fundamentalism vanishes under the weight of a consideration of a right to difference and cultural relativism. We've already witnessed prominent left intellectuals and activists publicly share the view that they could not care less if fundamentalist theocratic regimes come to power in Palestine or Iraq, provided that the USA and Israel get booted out. We have witnessed representatives of fundamentalist organizations and their ideologists be invited and cheered in social fora. Feminist sociologist Najee Al-Ali made a related critique of the anti-imperialism of the left that cheered the Iraqi resistance, which she said amounted to endorsing attacks on Shia civilians by jihadists linked to al-Qaeda. While friction between feminists and the boy left was nothing new, it also became much more brutal after 2001 than it had been 20 years later. It came to the fore internally in US movements in 2015 and 2016 in the context of the most domestically focused socialism we have seen in generations in the Bernie Sanders campaign. Although the Sanders activists took it in the teeth over and over again for the cost to government of their proposals, they rarely said the obvious thing, that spending $6 trillion on endless wars had artificially depressed the ability of governments to pay for things like education and healthcare. Indeed, it was the Trump campaign on the far right that most effectively mobilized a critique of the endless wars of the United States. But the friction between some in the Bernie campaign and feminists was harsh, memorialized as Bernie bros coming after feminists. While there was an effort in 2019 to insist that the existence of Bernie bros was a myth, plenty of us were there and remember it well. I even know a surprising number of so-called second wave feminists, active since the 80s, and socialists, every one of them, who refused to support the Bernie campaign, recalling the fights in the New Left since the anti-war movement. I know him, said one. He was the guy from SDS who refused to give the bullhorn to a woman ever, and noting that Sanders voted with Hillary Clinton 93% of the time in the Senate, even as she was being tarred and feathered on the left for her husband's neoliberal policies and support for prisons and policing. As an aside, I heard similar things from Black activists of a certain age. He was the guy who didn't show up for civil rights demonstrations if it was raining, but was always there for lunch afterward. Now, in fairness, I have to say that I'm not sure that these are literal memories of Sanders in the 1960s, but they do mark how 50 years later, old divisions on the left were remembered with a vengeance as part of a broader split in the left that haunted us as Sanders unexpectedly surged as a Democratic candidate. The intervening years since 2001 have seen only intermittent efforts to build out the transnationalism of feminist organizing in the United States, even as universities, once the epicenter of all kinds of feminist organizing, have grown steadily more transnational as their budgets have increasingly come to rely on tuition payments from students from abroad. I realized what this meant when I finally stopped being department chair after more than 10 years and was finally able to teach a course on US empire for the first time last year. I looked around my Zoom classroom and realized that I had a screen full of people who had experienced the violence of US empire firsthand in the countries where they grew up, together with a handful of American Jewish students who had been schooled by the Palestine Solidarity Movement. In both patterns of migration and in our classrooms, the empire is here, but this is only occasionally reflected in our political work. The massive and important exception to this domesticization of the women's movement has been among the Black feminists of the movement for Black lives. When we pay attention to the Red, Black, and Green New Deal or undocumented Black solidarity with Haitian immigrants, We're hearing the sounds of a new Pan-Africanism in support not only of Africa's decolonized nations, but also the globalized Black diaspora. These are also the most clear-sighted part of the US socialist movement in recognizing that while the neoliberalism of the Obama administration was a significant problem, it is, one, largely passing away, and two, less alarming than the far-right fascism in the Republican Party, and represented as paramilitarized formations in police departments, ICE, Border Patrol, the US Armed Forces, the Drug Enforcement Agency, among others, and linked to the authoritarian right transnationally and in groups and in informally organized paramilitary groups in the US. The queer and feminist leadership of the movement for Black Lives has consistently and forcefully articulated a critique of US empire since its earliest days, and has been nurtured and schooled by an older generation of Black feminist activists like Angela Davis, Kathy Cohen, and Barbara Ransby, who came of age in a much more transnational left feminism. Another less noted offspring of the global women's movement is the movement for reproductive justice. We talk about reproductive justice as an effort to push back against the narrowness of a mainstream feminism that thinks in terms of white folks and those who are not impoverished. The mainstream feminist movement spoke about abortion and birth control, the choice not to have children, without noting that choice is a language of consumerism, and that in the context of forced sterilization in prisons and as a condition for receiving welfare and the police shooting of Black and Indigenous youth, the right to raise the children that folks want is at least as important in BIPOC and impoverished communities. It was in this context that Black women began organizing for reproductive justice. With the founding of the Sister Song Reproductive Health Collective, a group of Black women's health organizations and other autonomous women of color groups with a home base in Atlanta, organizations began articulating a reproductive justice framework as an alternative to a white-led movement that too often failed to focus on the social justice issues that were central to Indigenous communities and communities of color. This activist framework is founded on three key principles. One, the right not to have a child, including the right to abortion. Two, the right to have a child. And three, the right to parent the children we have, as well as to control our birthing options, such as midwifery. It made links between parents and the public services necessary for nurturing children, quality schools, good health care, freedom from personal and state violence, including policing, and environmentally safe communities. Without taking anything away from that story, which is the one that we predominantly tell about where reproductive justice came from, I want to draw our attention to how the reproductive justice framework also emerged from a rich and extensive engagement with the transnational activism of the global women's movement. I'm thinking about this in relation to a conversation with Loretta Ross, one of the most visible activists articulating a reproductive justice framework, and a piece she wrote in 2006, alongside my own experience with Latin American women's movements and in the Reproductive Rights National Network, which was a US group that emerged out of CARASA, the Coalition for Abortion Rights and to End Sterilization Abuse, founded in 1977, which, except for some particular moments when they successfully worked with mostly Puerto Rican activists, was the largely white left of the women's movement. First CARASA and then R2N2, which was the abbreviation for Reproductive Rights National Network, both always linked abortion to other issues, from forced sterilization to welfare to daycare. As Loretta Ross narrates it, the reproductive justice framework required two innovations in the political thinking of the global women's movement: the articulation of reproductive rights in 1984 and the linking of women's rights to human rights. Ross was always involved in the international women's movement, including the International Women's Decade Conferences in 1980 and 1985. In 1984, the International Women in Health meeting, which had developed out of the UN Women's Conference, met in Amsterdam and developed the term reproductive rights to articulate a relationship between gender equality and reproductive freedom. The Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights grew out of that Amsterdam meeting and articulated an early version of a reproductive justice framework, writing, quote, reproductive rights are a series of rights that enable all women, without discrimination on the basis of nationality, class, ethnicity, race, age, religion, disability, sexuality, or marital status, to decide whether or not to have children. This includes the right to have a safe legal abortion. This position statement was in response to Ronald Reagan's Mexico City declaration that year, which said that no NGO that sought US aid could advocate or perform abortions, even if it only used the aid for birth control or other reproductive health services. While this statement was inclusive of diverse issues, it was also grounded in individual rights, not in the obligations of governments. This made it much easier to understand in the United States, where individual rights are grounded in the US Constitution, but far from the intellectual labor necessary to develop the reproductive justice framework. It was Filipina activists in Gabriela which organized a 10,000-strong women's march to challenge the Marcos dictatorship and its ban on demonstrations in 1984 that first coined the phrase, women's rights are human rights, according to Loretta Ross. This flipped the conversation from individual rights to governments, grounding feminism in the norms and conventions of a UN framework that was born in the decolonization era. The phrase, affirming the obligations of states to provide a certain standard of living for all people, was also used by feminists at the 1993 Vienna Human Rights Conference, which brought it to bear on the example of domestic violence. As Ross wrote, historically, this had been the sort of crime that had been exempted from human rights claims because the violence occurred at the hands of an individual rather than a state. In declaring that human rights violations could occur in either public or private spheres, she writes, Women's Rights as Human Rights Declaration set the stage for fast-moving developments in both the human rights movement and the global women's movement. This, I would add, was the same period that women activists in Latin America, from Argentina to Mexico, were opposing disappearances, murder, and jailing of opposition leaders and torture, particularly of students and other young people, naming themselves as mothers of the disappeared and articulating the assault to their children as human rights violations by the state. It was in 1993 that mothers of disappeared women in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico began to articulate the assault on their children also as a human rights violation, arguing first that the state was complicit with the police either involved themselves in the killing or looking the other way as those associated with the border region's maquiladoras killed young women on their way home from work. The Maquila program operated with extraordinary latitude to ignore Mexico's environmental and labor regulations, and activists charged that they were also allowed impunity with respect to murder. As the Filipino framework for understanding women's rights as human rights spread, Mexican activists too began to conceptualize the torture and murder of women at the hands of husbands and other intimate partners as feminicide, state complicit killing, as men could anticipate impunity from the police and other authorities after harming women or trans women. And this too was part of Ross's political formation, as she attended encuentros in El Salvador, Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, Brazil, and Chile throughout these decades. The 1994 Cairo Conference on Population and Development was an earthquake in the impact of the global women's movement. Despite the strenuous objections of the Vatican and religious fundamentalists and allied states from all over the world, and indeed defeating much of the overpopulation establishment, feminists at the Cairo meeting carried the day in resolutions that linked poverty, development, and reproductive health. They pointed out that poverty was a deprivation of human rights that gave rise to vulnerability to HIV/AIDS, to domestic violence, and to unwanted childbearing. Population and international gender and development goals were linked fundamentally to the empowerment of women, setting up feminism as the enemy of authoritarian governments everywhere, including a conservative Catholicism that's given rise to a whole dark money establishment and a global right wing geared to rooting out so-called gender ideology, which among other things was somewhat hysterically linked to the rise of trans politics, abortion, birth control, and socialism. The 1995 Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women solidified these gains, as Hillary Clinton famously uttered the slogan, "Women's rights are human rights," underscoring the rights of women as a group to demand equal rights before states, including a standard of living adequate for themselves and their family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care and social services, education, elder care, and freedom from violence and state terror. While conservatives once again beat back the resolutions on sexual freedom, sexual pleasure, and sexual orientation, as they had in Cairo, feminists carried the day on sexual autonomy. The reproductive justice framework articulated in the United States by Ross and others was explicitly brought forward in a policy formation to bring Cairo home to a US context immediately after the adoption of the Cairo Program of Action in 1994. Specifically, it began as a signature ad in the Washington Post to speak to what Ross called the ominous silence of the Clinton administration's healthcare plan on the subject of abortion, appearing to renege on the promises it made at Cairo. Quite a number of women of color from the US participated in all the international conferences and significant events of the global feminist movement, often supported by the International Women's Health Coalition, the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, and funders like the Ford and Ms. Foundations, and that presence bore fruit in the articulation of the reproductive justice framework. Within a handful of years, the reproductive justice framework was everywhere. It was diffused throughout the 16 autonomous organizations that founded Sister Song. New organizations sprang up, and others changed their name to embrace this politics born in the human rights orientation of the international women's movement, like Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice. Now, more than 25 years later, it's embodied in scholarly books and articles and countless organizations throughout the abortion rights and women's movement. It has been held up as part of the Black freedom movement generally, including the movement to end police violence against African Americans, particularly as the Sweet Honey in the Rock song had it, the killing of Black mothers' sons. Most say that the intervention of reproductive justice is to build a US women's movement that's inclusive, not just of abortion rights and birth control, but more broadly of the struggle of women of color to have children and raise them. There's nothing wrong with this account, although it stumbles over the groups like the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse and CARASA that worked with Puerto Rican, Native, and Black activists in the 1970s to pass laws and regulations and file court cases against sterilization abuse and to try to stop the 1977 Hyde Amendment that ended Medicaid funding for abortion. But mostly what it forgets is our debt to a global women's movement and those who risked their lives in the 70s and 80s in places like the Philippines, Argentina, and El Salvador to insist that feminists and women as mothers had a role to play in defying authoritarian regimes. It also makes us in the United States particularly illiterate in what the international fight to stop the demonization of something called gender ideology, feminism, and trans freedom by the transnational right. But mostly it obscures how everyday struggles against racism in the United States are embedded also in the history of a global women's movement. And so I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much for this historical contextualization of where we are today and why we're here in terms of transnational feminist movements and the uninternational nature of feminism right now in the US. So thank you so much. I want to spend a few minutes sort of unpacking some of the things you addressed, and then from our audience, we're happy to take your questions in the Q&A for Laura to address moving forward. So one of the things that really struck me in your talk was the ways in which you talked about feminisms being stuck between fascism and fundamentalism. And we still see that unfolding today in a global context. But how do you see that unfolding here in the US, maybe vis-a-vis how it's unfolding in other parts of the world? Because we certainly know it is.
Right. Let me start by saying I was not among the people who in the Reagan era was casually throwing around the term fascism to talk about the emergence of a neoliberal right. And so I use the term, I'm interested in possibly what it does to help us focus our minds to think about these formations on the right, like the Oath Keepers, like the Proud Boys, as fascist in orientation. Certainly they are authoritarian, which seems to be, we seem to have settled on authoritarian populism as a kind of middle ground where we don't have to say fascism. And I'm actually uncomfortable with that in the sense that populism seems to invoke for us the idea, or that has been promulgated in the United States context, that it's really a white working class that has backed these movements. And I don't think we're seeing tons of evidence of that. If we think of the Trump election as an authoritarian populist formation, the average Trump voter made more money than the average Hillary Clinton voter in 2016. And likewise, I think in the context of the January 6th insurrection, the attempt to, frankly, overthrow the Congress in the interest of installing Trump as apparently a leader unbounded by democratic norms or principles. Likewise, those people who've been identified are not conspicuously working class at all. They are judges, they are, some of them are cops and in the military, but they're also real estate agents. Somebody took a private chartered jet to the January 6th insurrection. So I think I think this formation is certainly alarming, certainly allied with a global racist right wing that for whom gender is a primary formation. It's also been interesting watching the press sort of tune with how to characterize the Proud Boys as a misogynist formation. I also saw male chauvinist, and I thought, it's the 70s. I haven't heard male chauvinist since the 70s. But so for me, naming it as a fascist formation names its militarism and names its history and white supremacy, and so that's what I'm tuning with. I'm not so interested in authoritarian populism, but at any rate, it is terribly important that we understand this as an anti-feminist formation, as a global formation with allies on the alt-right in Europe and in places like Brazil and India and Hungary, Turkey. And we think, and in some ways with Boris Johnson in the UK and the Brexit formation, I think we've got to start talking in starker terms about what's happening. I think especially as we watch some of the insurrectionists in the US Congress speak, it becomes increasingly clear that they're not interested in governing. They're interested in going on the news and speaking out on Twitter in ways that are particularly alarming.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And we already have some great questions coming in through the Q&A, which one really dovetails nicely with this first question that I asked. Nell asks, how about describing Trump's followers as white authoritarian nationalists as an alternative to fascists? Where might we end up if we sort of rethink the narrative?
I think I've also been using white nationalists, and I like white authoritarian nationalists. It seems to me that it does a lot of good work. Some experts on the right really object to characterizing this formation as a nationalism, because actually it's so explicitly transnational and rooted in sometimes religious fundamentalism and sometimes simply militarism, certainly in a kind of global projection of whiteness. But I welcome the term and appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And as sort of you think about the transnational aspects of how these various isms are unfolding, how do you sort of see the unfolding ways in which neoliberalism is co-opting some of the language of feminism? You mentioned how Bush had co-opted liberal feminism to justify attacking Afghanistan, among other places, I believe. I'm sorry, Iraq. So it's sort of
Afghanistan. Yeah.
I feel terrible as someone from that part of the world to get that wrong.
The U.S. global war on terror is now in 20 countries. Like it's easy to feel, completely confused about what the target is, because it's not a thing.
It's not a thing. It's not bounded by borders per se, but an ideology. So can you sort of speak to what do we do for those of us who identify as feminists when the language and narrative gets co-opted?
Right. I was just talking to my students about this, that we're talking about the feminist movement in the 70s, and saying that the really important thing to distinguish feminism from its co-optation is that feminism never advocated individual empowerment, saying that. So also on International Women's Day, and I almost mentioned this, but it became a long digression, not to say rant, is that Walmart also did an International Women's Day thing about women CEOs in places like Walmart. And the thing, of course, that's so outrageous about that is that Walmart is one of a number of companies that relies particularly on female or feminized labor to run McJobs, right? That are underpaid and exploitative. And so you could point that point to Walmart that as a company that particularly uses an anti-feminist version of neoliberalism, rooted not incidentally in Christian right evangelical formation. So that's one of the things I would use to distinguish. It's not individual empowerment, it's mass movement. And when we're in the presence of, individuals can be so empowered and run things, then we know we're not in the presence of a historic feminist formation. We're in the presence of something else. And I think the other piece of it is feminists have actually been really particularly good at thinking about and articulating what is neoliberal, what is neoliberalism, and what is neoliberal about certain kinds of economic policies. And that's because feminism has long been clear-sighted about what happens when you start separating public and private economies, public and private spheres. And neoliberalism relies so intensely on privatizing all sorts of things, not just privatizing in the economic sense, but privatizing in the sense of the domestic, making healthcare and childcare and all sorts of household labor, the responsibility not of government or of corporations through taxation, but of individuals. And so we need to help people see clearly how neoliberalism works and what it does, and that it works hard at diminishing the role of the state and diminishing a sense of the responsibility for the common good that corporations might be asked to bear.
Yeah.
So when we know what neoliberalism is, it's not so confusing anymore.
Yeah, no, I really, really like sort of the naming so that we can address it, of compartmentalizing the mechanisms through which neoliberalism works, sometimes co-opting and sometimes working in parallel with existing feminist tropes. Erin, I know you have a really good question. One of the things I wanted to follow up on before I get to Erin's question here in the Q&A is, as the pandemic continues to unfold, we're seeing a crisis of care, as it's put. And I sort of wanted to get your analysis on how you see the intersections of racism or race in the context of the care economy and neoliberalism as it's unfolding in the pandemic, where we're constantly being told care and caregiving are so important, it's foundational to the economy, but at the same time, where will we end up post Zoom and post pandemic?
Yes. It's super interesting. It's super interesting visually, right? You and I are wearing headphones because our children are somewhere in the background raising hell while we ignore them, right? And but it seems to me that on the one hand, the pandemic has made care labor more visible, and it has also reduced the effectiveness of certain kinds of neoliberal strategies. Like, you have to, like, some universities have asked people to sign a commitment not to care for their children during their work time. So this is the effort of trying to make care labor invisible and make it go away, essentially. Workers don't have care labor. Workers don't do care labor. Well, yes, actually, we do. And specifically, and it strikes me that for an emerging center-left coalition that is gaining some shape in the Biden administration, the success in naming care labor as a thing that has to be addressed and that the state has to address. This, I think, has been the particular effect of closing schools, right? On the right, what they've sought to do is portray teachers as somehow irresponsible and uncaring and engaged in some insane activity to try to reduce their risk of infection. But even not just on the left, but in the center, teachers have become far more visible as not just engaging in labor that can be made invisible, but as engaged in labor for which the state plays a role. And the National Domestic Workers Alliance, I think, has played an incredibly important role in also making visible at the same time the labor of particularly Black, Latinx, and immigrant caregivers in the paid care work economy, precisely because they have not been able to work from home. They've been some of the folks most exposed, most at risk, even as they've become marked as drivers of the pandemic as they go to work in nursing homes or individual homes. The work of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and its allies in building a center-left coalition with the Biden administration, and thus making his current infrastructure plan centrally naming paid caregiving labor as part of the infrastructure that the US state must support is just remarkable. Like, if you had told me 4 years ago that that was going to happen, you could have knocked me over with a feather. But this NDWA, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, as part of the Movement for Black Lives ecosystem, has gained visibility alongside other components of the Movement for Black Lives vision for a Black left and for a U.S. left that the state is taking notice of. We'll cross our fingers and see if this can actually hold as, in fact, legislative proposals. But it's clearly front and center on a lot of people's agendas.
No, I appreciate that. In fact, when we often talk about infrastructure, it's such a masculinized term. You think of buildings and bridges and roads, but not the invisible but highly required labor that economies, as they are arranged now, need in order to function. So, really sort of bringing that to the forefront has been tremendously important. So thank you for sort of expanding on that. I'm going to go to Aaron's question. He says, thank you so much for joining us today and for especially your incredibly inspiring work. I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which you think there was a significant strain of the feminist movement of the 1970s and 80s that was transnational in the sense that it was committed to, or at least open to, the anti-communist orientations of the broader US imperial project. I'm thinking in particular of the Gloria Steinem's admitted connections to the CIA as a particularly striking example, and wondering whether this might have been symptomatic of broader tendencies and tensions within feminist movement. I wonder if that could tell us something about how the post-2001 ambitions of the feminist movement have been shaped in relation to a culture of imperial decline here in the US.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It was so Gloria Steinem has never adequately, in my mind, accounted for her work as a CIA informant. We know that the FBI believed that the U.S. women's movement was a threat to national security. J. Edgar Hoover had all sorts of people infiltrating women's movement organizations. But what we see in the mainstream of the movement, not just Gloria Steinem, but I'm thinking also of Betty Friedan, is dramatically informed by the anti-communist imaginary of the Cold War, right? Betty Friedan, who had to repudiate her own history in the UE, in the communist-affiliated union, United Electrical Workers, in order to assume a role as just a housewife. And I think what we see in these mid-century political movements, and I would say the same about the furthest right corners or even the center of civil rights, that the necessity of repudiating its own roots, their own roots, both of them, women's movement and the Black freedom movement, in the 1930s in socialist activism, gives us a lot of insight into what seemed possible in the middle of the 20th century. And yeah, absolutely, the women's movement has always been, it's always had this component of sort of respectability, of liberalism, of, you know, of centrism that allied itself with anti-communism. And I think that calling attention, so what I want to do is call more attention to what the left of the feminist movement was doing, not because I want to ignore the problem of the center or center right of the women's movement, but because, and the ways that it certainly ran for cover after 2001 to sort of ally itself with the George Bush moment. It was a scary moment, right? People in women's studies departments and in ethnic studies departments were being called out, were being fired, were being threatened, were getting death threats if they seemed inadequately nationalist, inadequately militarist, and if they were criticizing George Bush and this deployment of feminism. And I want to give people credit for more than just being individually scared, right? There was also a question about how was it possible to move? How could one be effective politically in those moments? So I think that was also at stake in what the left and center of the women's movement were doing in 2001.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Laura, for expanding on sort of Aaron's question. I've got a couple more, and again, you know, I'd welcome questions from the audience as they're sort of listening in. Where and how do you locate transnational feminisms today globally? As we've sort of seen so much authoritarianism / fundamentalisms rise, are there sort of locations that we can point to or groups that are sort of leading the transnational feminist work?
Oh, that's super interesting. I've been paying a lot of attention to the movement against gender, or to the movement against the people against gender ideology, right? Which some people are calling Catholic fascism and other people are calling a great authoritarian right empire. And so I think that's an interesting place. I have found international interesting work going on against surrogacy transnationally, including the growing effort to legalize surrogacy in more US states, because of course California has become an international surrogacy hub, and most people in the US have trouble articulating their relationship to that. And so it's actually been, particularly with reference to European movements, to make surrogacy safer work that is more willing to recognize the right of women to protect their own health, even if they're working as surrogates. And then there's also, I think, growing work. Of course, I said movement for Black lives, and I think that's the absolute sort of center of the US left right now, and the transnational US left. And if it's not, that's because there are people on the white left who are out to lunch and not recognizing how clear-sighted and articulate the vision for Black lives is for all of us. I think that work is clearly transnational and centrally transnational. I think the Palestine solidarity work in the US has been a place where feminists have articulated an opposition to US empire. Where it's not particularly is in this, in the work in any kind of transnational account of US empire. The exception is, small numbers of people doing sort of Kurdish solidarity work, the International Women's Army or the Feminist Army of Rojava. But that's small. So a lot of little places, much less than I think we need, especially for those of us in the US. I think we're just so much smarter when we're in conversation with transnational lefts.
Yeah. And just a follow up from Aditi, who says also international surrogacy from Western clients in countries like India, in sort of, expanding on the idea that the international dimensions of surrogacy. I think I've heard it called womb for rent, essentially where the working and living conditions of such women are no different than some of the factory floors we associate with Southeast Asia in many, many different contexts.
Yeah, I really appreciate that addition. I thought that went without saying, that India is the center of this, but of course it doesn't go without saying. I appreciate you saying it.
Yeah. So one of the other follow-ups, and again, it's from Aditi, who sort of wants to, I suppose, expand upon some of the ways you're seeing Indigenous women's environmental activism within this umbrella of transnational feminisms.
Yes. So if you had asked me 10 years ago if American Indian movement women, were thinking in terms of the transnational dimensions of environmental solidarity, I would have said, no, not so much. That's clearly not true now. I think the emergence of transnational solidarities around all kinds of environmental activism, but particularly Indigenous activism, because that's so much the center of it globally, or such an important center of it at any rate globally, that I think that's really important. Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. So one of the questions is we, are happy to take those from the audience. I want to sort of follow up on this idea of transnational feminisms. What are some of the ingredients that you think about when you hear anti-racism in the context of transnational feminisms? Are there sort of similarities across contexts, or do you really see different iterations of anti-racism take shape across geographies?
Well, the thing about racism is that it is local and particular in its manifestations, right? So Latinx can almost be a flavor of white on the East Coast, and it's a race in the heart of the Southwest, right? So, and that's just to pick a US example. And everybody's racism seems sort of crazy if you're not embedded in it. I remember being in Sweden and listening to people go on about people with certain kinds of identity numbers, identity numbers, I think, that started with 9. And I realized just from the way that they were speaking that these were racialized people. And I came to realize that they were, in fact, talking about refugees. And the whole thing seemed insane from my point of view, right? The racially marked identity numbers. But that said, I think what we saw this past summer in the Black Lives Matter uprisings is the way that they spread from place to place across the globe as people appropriated them to talk about local conditions. And so I haven't read it and I'll get the name wrong, but the report that came out today in the UK about policing and whether stop and frisk was a racist practice in the UK, or if it was just racist in the US. And what about the Caribbean? And you know, they concluded, not surprisingly, that it wasn't racist in the UK. And this has been all over my social media feed, is, you know, people pouncing on this with fury and frustration, who are anti-racist activists in the UK. But what we saw was that it moved from place to place as a way of characterizing the status of Palestinians in Greater Israel, and as a way of articulating ethnic differences across Asia, Central Asia. So yes, it's particular, and no, it's not, right? It can be, these languages of anti-racism can be tremendously productive across place.
No, thank you for sort of expanding and contracting on that, because it is locally specific and manifests, but there is some threads across some boundaries of sorts globally. One of the things you mentioned during your talk, which is quite true as we are now on Zoom and kind of seeing our students online, is this notion of empire is here, right? When we're talking to students about concepts, how have you sort of thought about transnational feminisms, anti-racism, particularly when the ideas and concepts don't translate or are not agreed upon by students whose experiences or even personal beliefs really run counter to that? How do you sort of hold that space for conversations when you sort of engage students?
Well, so yeah, I had to throw that into the talk because it was such a riveting experience for me. Last semester was like, it must have been what it felt like to first start teaching about women as a political marked category. To start speaking about US empire, I was much more aware than I ever have been before. And obviously I've talked about US empire for much of my adult life, all of it, I suspect, that the term resonated with people's experience of very specific violence. And and people understood themselves as having a relationship to this very complex term, US empire, which, you know, takes in everything from forms of capitalism to the archipelago of US bases that straddle the globe, to formations like anti-racism and feminism that have also been accused of being imperial, accused of misrepresenting local conditions. And I don't think that I have any particular strategies for how to think about feminism in a transnational context, except that it seems like the lines are getting starker. The emergence of an anti-authoritarian white nationalist right, or of an authoritarian white nationalist right across locations, that is also anti-feminist to its core, and the emergence simultaneously of an ascendant religious fundamentalism that crosses religious boundaries, has made thinking about women as a political category, which I think is sort of the heart of what feminism is. Whatever else, it's that women and feminized people, or females and femmes, are that's a political category that does political work, and I find that resonates across a lot of spaces.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because we, I think, are all sort of seeing different experiences and people and faces on our Zoom sessions. And it's harder to read sometimes what those experiences might be. One of the things I wanted to pivot on, and again, for our audience, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Post George Floyd, we have seen a plethora of racial justice, anti-racist statements coming out from a multiple set of organizations, a lot in the private sector, I would say, only some in the public sector. And I just want to kind of take a moment to reflect on that and to say, is this a real moment in which we're seeing some sort of engagement with politics that can be about justice, or are we seeing something else take shape in this moment, in whether or not you think anything will come of it that is productive and positive?
Such a great question, and it is certainly the question of the moment. What do all these kinds of statements do? Do they do anything? And the answer to that is really about, how do we pick it up, and in the service of what? Obviously, these kinds of statements are, on the one hand, the product of the individualization of politics and collectivism. And we don't need a mass politics, because it's all about what we do sitting in our homes in front, engaging with social media. On the other hand, clearly they provide some kind of opening for a mass movement, and they do something, right? I'm really interested in something that's had very little impact, but there was an article 2 weeks ago, well, and it's because we're in the middle of the Derek Chauvin trial, which is so riveting in itself, but and horrifying. We can't talk about anything else in my classes. But 2 weeks ago, the New York Times ran a front page, top of the fold Sunday piece on the proliferation also of reports on police violence that the police violence was used against Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. And what was striking to me was not the violence. I hate to say it, but that's normal. What was striking to me was that police departments and city governments and private organizations denounced the violence by the police against activists who were perceived to be Black, or were perceived to be in alliance with Black folks. I've been to a lot of anti-police violence demonstrations since the 80s. And, usually what happens is the police come and they beat people up, right? That was my experience over and over again in Boston. So I attribute the need to at least name that to all these statements of solidarity. The dangerous thing is what the Biden campaign then did, which was ask people to step back from mass demonstrations, ask people to step back from defund the police kinds of statements, saying that, this is scaring people away from voting for Democrats. And we have to reassure them that that's going to be a safe thing to do. And if we don't want to face down right-wing authoritarian nationalism in, in a second Trump administration, we have to do what's practical here. And obviously, they made a lot of promises in exchange for that stepping back, and we're seeing some of them, right? We're seeing $300 a month payments for all caregivers with children. Only for 6 months, but it's really interesting. We haven't seen anything like this since Clinton announced that he was going to end welfare as we know it. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it in picking up the National Domestic Workers Alliance demand for better pay for caregivers. So it's a complicated moment. Anyway, I think I've strayed far from the original question, but this is something that keeps me awake at night, is trying to figure out what is this moment. It's really contradictory.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I understand, I feel that Zoom always causes me to lose track of time and to lose track of questions too. So, I think we all will see if these statements become meaningful action and or policy in some little ways. As we're sort of, coming out to the last 15 minutes here, one of the questions I had for you and really just thinking through these issues is, we have sort of individuals who are feeling good about themselves. They're clicking on issues, they're tweeting, they're demonstrating their anti-racist practice. And on the other hand, you have
they've read white fragility.
They have, everyone's read it. There's sort of a list of things that they have read and are starting to do. And then on the other hand, you have these large scale movements, it seems. Is there some place in the middle? Is there some place between individuals sitting in front of their social media, clicking away, and these larger collective movements of people demonstrating? Is there any space in the middle for anything that could be productive or useful?
Well, I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but it strikes me that I started us down the, I started us by saying, collectivism is a problem, but it also does work, right? Everybody I know who's up in arms about this UK report that came out today is going to do something, that they're going to contact each other. And, middle schoolers organized Black Lives Matter protests here in the small town I live in, and we all went, right? That's astonishing that can work. And that's what social media also gives us. It also gave us the January 6th insurrection, right? And gives us anti-vaccination campaigns. So it seems to me that social media, when it results in people able to talk to each other and do work together, is amazing. And when it doesn't, when it further isolates us and individualizes us, then it's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, potentially there's some use to us doing this kind of work individually, but also simultaneously and collectively, it seems, through social media. One of the things I had on my mind as we were discussing, and I know we're sort of coming to the end of our time, is, what gives you hope these days when it seems like there's so many things that are going on that globally cause concern and worry, particularly if you're a feminist activist or scholar even these days that are being attacked in various methods. But are there things that give you hope and inspiration?
Lots. it's a cliche, but I get to be in contact with a lot of young people, from middle schoolers and high schoolers to college students, and all their activist connections. And they're in good shape. They are extraordinary. Um, so so I don't think that you can't just look for the next generation to change the world, in the sense that maybe the old bad people will die off, because I think some of us start out passionate and idealistic when we're young, and become those scary old bad people. And so the work is to create the spaces that continue to activate people throughout their lives. But it's very exciting to me to work with environmental activists, to work with anti-racist activists. And, this is nuts, but Zoom is, and all our connections online are making space for all kind of webinars. I've been to more activist webinars in the last year than I've been to activist workshops in the longest time. I remember in the 70s and 80s, we used to organize panels, activist panels, not academic panels, all the time. And I haven't been hearing about those in a long time, but online I'm hearing about them constantly. And I think they've made a big difference. I don't think that, for example, it was an accident that the organizing for Movement for Black Lives protests was possible this summer. It was possible in part because people were getting reading lists that were incredibly moving. And people were attending webinars and reaching out to each other. And I don't think we're going to give up on Zoom webinars once we can connect again in person. I think the ability to work with and hear from people from all over the place, all over the world, is astonishing. And it's certainly made a difference in how I feel, how I think, how I encounter the world. And, I hope it continues.
Yeah, thank you for that. It sounds like there's new coalitions of people and places coming in, made partly possible by Zoom and our ability to connect. And, moving forward, potentially that will be a way for us to continue these actions, conversations. My last question to you is, what do you say to those of us who are in the space of scholarly work and activism as we engage, naysayers who say that this kind of work is not useful, it's not helpful in academia or in other contexts?
Well, there are always going to be people who don't get the word. The task is not to listen to them. I'll tell you a personal story, and it's not the most revolutionary story there is, but 4 years ago, I published a book from how all politics became reproductive politics, from welfare reform to foreclosure to Trump. And one of the readers for the University of California Press board said, "What's the point of publishing a book like this? Because the space for these kinds of proposals that this book is making, things like vastly improving wages and working conditions for paid caregivers, and a pathway to citizenship for immigrants and refugees, expanding the space for recognizing caregiving labor." The moment for these is past, and nobody's listening anymore. And of course, here we are 4 years later, and these are the exact proposals that are on, they weren't my proposals. They're just what any left feminist would say, right? But so the very things that are impossible 4 years ago are,
Mhm.
boring legislative proposals now. So it seems to me that this is clearly a moment where we understand what the point of activism and activist scholarship and scholar activists is, because it changed not just the US presidency, but what I hear from my friends in India and Brazil, who are really very concerned about their current leadership in Israel, is that voting Trump out of office inspired them to believe that change is possible. And, it's terrible that the US is the center of this media universe that ignores virtually everybody else. But it has its moments of being useful in informing hopes and dreams at times when progressive things, center-left coalitions seem vaguely possible in the US right now.
Laura, I could not ask for a better sort of concluding thought and inspiration to continue this work, to continue the activism. And I'm really indebted to you today for taking the time to share your thoughts, your experiences, and provide us a rich history of our present. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. To everyone, we look forward to seeing you in our third and final installment of these conversation series with Professor Chandra Talpade Mohanty on May 6th. And in the meanwhile, keep well, keep struggling against anti-racism, which we all will do. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next event. Thank you so much.